Buonasera, iniziamo con il nostro seminario dell'Asian Community in Europe. È un progetto promosso da ormai 5 anni dall'Eurasia Foundation. Quest'anno ho detto più volte abbiamo organizzato un ciclo di seminari della quinta edizione. Oggi abbiamo tutti gli ospiti sono importanti, ma oggi veramente abbiamo un ospite di riguardo. To us it's a great pleasure to welcome an important guest in the field of Korean cinema, Professor Dasi Paket. He's a film critic, subtitle translator, scholar, and in particular, one of the most influential figures in promoting Korean cinema abroad. He is best known internationally for his work subtitling Bong Joon-ho. I think many of you have seen the film entitled Parasite, as well as Decision to Live by Park Chan-wook. His deep understanding of Korean language and culture allows him to bridge cinematic storytelling across borders with rare insight and elegance. With dual master degrees in Slavic linguistics and applied linguistics from Indiana University, Darcy Packet has lived now in Korea since the late 1990s. So I think he is more Korean than me. He founded the essential English language website koreanfilm.org and served as a correspondent for publication like Screening International Variety and Cine 21. And he has held teaching roles at institutes such as Korea대, Korea University, Gyeonggi University, and more recently at the Busan Asian Film School, where he's serving as adjunct professor. And he is also the founder and co-director of the Wildflower Film Awards Korea, which celebrates Korean's independent cinema. And in recognition of his extraordinary contribution, Darcy Packet was named an honorary citizen of Busan in 2020 and has received multiple important awards, including the Kim Dae-jung Nobel Peace Film Award and the Kofra Award for introducing Korean cinema to the world. So we are so happy to have him with us. Actually, he has been here 3 years ago. He took another lecture on Korean, the translation of Korean cinema. So I'm so happy. We are so happy to have you here, and thank you again for accepting our invitation. So, con un applauso.
Okay, thank you for coming today. I always enjoyed talking about subtitle translation because it's a really difficult but really interesting process. And I think that there are a lot of kind of interesting decisions that you have to make when you're translating subtitles. So today I want to kind of introduce how subtitle translation works and show you some examples. And yeah, I think that there's kind of a lot to cover. Briefly, just to explain how I ended up doing this kind of work. I was interested in languages. I majored in Russian as an undergraduate and spent some time in Russia in the 1990s. And after getting certified to teach English, I decided to come to Korea for 2 years. And I had a lot of Korean friends in grad school, and I thought, I'll spend 2 years in Korea and then I'll move on to another country. And that was 27 years ago, and I'm still stuck in Korea. really enjoyed Korea. One of the things I did after I arrived was I started watching Korean films, and they were really interesting. And this was the late 1990s when the rest of the world didn't know anything about Korean movies. And I'd watch an interesting film and I'd go online looking for information about the film, and there'd be nothing in English. So I decided to make a website just to put the information that I knew about Korean films up on the web in English. And I think my timing was perfect because I launched the website in 1999, and then we had movies like Shidi and JSA and My Sassy Girl and all of these movies which began to make an impression internationally. So many people began to find my website, including an editor at the British film trade magazine, Screen International. And they were looking for somebody who could write about the Korean film industry, somebody based in Korea. And they asked me to work for them. So starting in 2001, I began working as a journalist. And one of the great things about working as a journalist is that you learn new things every day, and you also meet an incredible number of people. So I started to get to know many people in the Korean film industry, including people who were responsible for selling Korean films abroad. And so these companies, they oversaw the process of kind of subtitling Korean films. And sometimes they would get a translation back from a translator and they weren't happy with the translation. So initially I started just by kind of revising or polishing other people's translations. And I found the work really interesting and I wanted to do it myself. At the time, my Korean was okay, but I didn't feel confident enough to just translate an entire film by myself. So I began co-translating with a Korean friend of mine who was a filmmaker and who spoke English really well. And so for a number of years, I worked as a co-translator. And then it was about 10 years ago that I felt that my Korean was good enough that I could start translating myself. And so over the years, I've been lucky to work with some really great filmmakers. I don't know, it's a big responsibility, but also just very exciting to be able to work with them. And so I'll talk today a bit about kind of my experience working with them. Yeah, this is like what I'd like to talk about today. First, I want to just tell you a little bit about how subtitles work. Starting with the most basic things like the format and the style. The other interesting thing about subtitle translation is that there's a whole time element to it. They appear on the screen and then they disappear. And that affects how you translate the dialogue. So we'll talk about that. I'd like to give you some kind of examples about, from different films and how we approach the translation. I'll talk about the process of translating films and then how you translate kind of cultural things that the Korean audience is very familiar with, but international audiences aren't as familiar with. And then talk about, sometimes people talk a lot about how meaning is lost in translation, but sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes meaning is added in translation as well. So I'll give you a couple examples. And then part 3, assuming there's time, I want to kind of do some, live revision of a set of subtitles. I have a small clip from a movie, and I want to show you kind of the process of taking a rough translation and then turning it into a more refined translation. But let me just start about talking about the format. When you translate subtitles, there are some basic limitations. Usually you have 1 or 2 lines of text, and you have a maximum number of characters per line. So if it screens at film festivals, often it's like 37 characters, including spaces. If it screens on Netflix, it's typically 42 characters. You also want to make sure that the audience has enough time to read the subtitles. And you can either kind of do it by ear and look at it and try to, feel if there's enough time for the audience to read it. But if you work in a subtitling program, they'll also tell you like how many characters per second a certain subtitle is. And so if the subtitle lasts for 1 second and you have kind of 25 characters in the subtitle, then that's 25 characters per second, which is too much. Typically, you want to keep it to 20 characters per second. There are also special rules about kind of dividing up the sentence within a subtitle. So there are 2 examples up here. It's the exact same words, but they're divided in a slightly different place. Like the word you is on the bottom in the lower example and on the top. And I would argue that one of these is much better than the other. And basically, it makes sense, I think, to divide the lines according to the grammatical structure. So this word right here, the object of this sentence is, you speak English quite well. It's the phrase. So I've been led to believe you speak English quite well. If you do it like it's written on the top, when you start to read it, it sounds like you is the subject. So I've been led to believe you. And then you get to the bottom, and then your brain has to reprocess this sentence. So I think that, it's not something that people are aware of as they're watching a film. But if you do this consistently, then I think the subtitles are a little bit easier to read and to follow. So Netflix has rules about this as well. They always tell their translators to divide lines according to the grammar. There are some other things, like there's special rules about italics when you do subtitle translation. Anything that's heard through some kind of electronic media. So if somebody's talking on a phone and we hear the voice coming through the phone, then we write that in italics. Or television broadcasts, loudspeakers. The other thing that we do is when we hear a voice, but the voice is not in the scene. So there are a couple different examples of this, like voiceover narration, when we hear a character explaining what's happening in a certain scene. Sometimes we hear a character thinking, but they're not actually speaking in the scene. We're just hearing their thoughts. And then sometimes you have sound from one scene that overlaps into the next scene. Basically, if the voice is not physically in the scene, then we write it with italics. And I'll show you an example of this from the movie Cobweb. So at the beginning, these 4 people are talking to each other. And then at the end of this scene, we start to hear the director's thoughts. And his lips aren't moving, but we hear him thinking. So that's written in italics.
그럼 어디서부터 다시 찍을까요?
이민자가 오해사와 처음 만나는 장면에서부터 다시 찍자.
아, 너무 초반이긴 한데 바로 준비할까요?
결말을 바꾸려면 그 장면부터 다시 찍어야 돼.
네, 준비하겠습니다.
준비하겠습니다.
관객들은 새로운 걸 원한다. 더 강렬하고 한 번도 보지 못한 아주 색다른 장면을 만들어야 돼.
Okay, so it's pretty simple, but I think it helps the audience to understand about where the voice is coming from. On-screen text is a nightmare for subtitle translators. A lot of like in this shot right here, the text that's on these posters is important, And the audience, if they can understand what's on the text, then that helps them. But particularly when somebody's speaking at the same time, it's really hard to put the information all on the screen. The thing that's hardest these days are when you have live stream, and then you have the comments popping up next to it. There are a lot of movies that do that these days. And even when you're watching in Korean, you don't read every comment, but you can often get a general idea of what people are saying. So, sometimes when you're doing the translation, if you use a special program, you can put the translation of the text in another part of the screen. Sometimes, like with Netflix, they don't do that. Everything is down the bottom. And you have to kind of decide what you can show, what you can translate, and what you have to leave out. And there's one other thing I'd just like to mention, because they're kind of two different styles of subtitles. And it has to do with the full stop or the period. Some subtitles write a full stop at the end of every sentence. But there's another style that, I'm not sure exactly how when the two styles diverged. I think that it's kind of an older tradition. But in that style, you don't use a period at the end of a sentence unless you have two short sentences together, in which case you put one at the end of the first sentence, but not the second sentence. You still use question marks or exclamation points. If there's a long sentence that continues over two subtitles, then you use an ellipsis to show that it will continue. It's more common in documentaries than in feature films, I think. And it's not very common in Korea. So I've only done this once when the director specifically requested it. But it is quite common. And to show you an example of this is not a Korean film. This is a Taiwanese film called A One and a Two by Edward Yang, or Yi. It's a great film. But I'll just show you the scene, and you can notice how the punctuation is a little bit different from other kinds of subtitles.
有什么用？有什么用啊？去年你们赚的再多有什么用？现在电脑谁不会做啊？跟以前做成衣有什么两样？杀价杀到后来，有的做比没得做，赔得还凶。靠！你们不但不知道见好就收，居然还自作聪明的去增资贷款，扩充生产线。你们这样叫我怎么办？你们自己把自己搞成这个样子，你他妈的叫我怎么办啊？各位大哥啊！
我们还是有我们的计划，一步一步来。不过目前是转型期嘛，总是会有些起起伏伏的这个。
我先跟你讲好，如果对你们公司的评估再有一次不理想的话，我就叫我老板撤资。有转型计划为什么不讲出来听一听呢？你们也是要搞软体哦，啊，还是要搞那个 content？
这还用讲？不过啊，目前是保密阶段。你听过日本的大田吧？
电脑游戏哦，
这个你就不懂了吧？
可以哦。OK， 继续。
我们啊，永远是走在这个时代尖端的。
对，你们当然永远是走在时代的尖端啦。我们不投资你有个屁用。
Okay, so I'll be honest, I like the full stop at the end when I'm watching movies because I know that the sentence has finished at that point. But there are some viewers who are very attached to this style and have become used to it. So there are these two different styles. Okay, I'd like to talk about the timing as well. We use the word spotting to describe the process of dividing up sentences and deciding how to present the sentences on screen. So spotting is, dividing or combining sentences into individual subtitles. And it depends on I mean, really mostly on the actors and how they're delivering a line. If they pause in the middle. If it's a long sentence, it'll be more comfortable to read if you divide it into several subtitles. And if the actor pauses in the middle of the sentence, then that's typically a good place to divide it into two. So I'll show you a basic example first. This is from the movie called The Spy Gone North, or Kongjak. And it's quite a long sentence. And I'm going to show you 3 different versions of the same clip. And in the first version, it's just the whole sentence is on the screen for the whole time. So let's watch that first.
케이스부터 무브먼트까지 롤렉 본사에서도 진품이라고 판정할 만큼 완벽하게 모사된 걸작이니까 안심하고 사용해.
I mean, so it's possible to read it, but it's a lot of text, and it's more comfortable if you divide it up. Version 2, I just chopped it in half in the middle and presented it without thinking about the actors' pause in their voice or whatever.
케이스부터 무브먼트까지 롤렉 본사에서도 진품이라고 판정할 만큼 완벽하게 모사된 걸작이니까 안심하고 사용해.
Okay, and this is easier to read, and it's not terrible, but I think that the best thing to do is to divide it into 3 parts rather than 2. When you listen to his voice, there are 2 moments where he kind of pauses. And actually in this clip, the cut, like the shot also changes. When he pauses, then we cut to a different shot. And, you can also think about the editing when you're deciding how to divide up subtitles like this. But in version 3, we divide the lines according to the pauses in his delivery.
케이스부터 무브먼트까지 롤렉 본사에서도 진품이라고 판정할 만큼 완벽하게 모사된 걸작이니까 안심하고 사용해.
Okay, so I think it's more comfortable this way as well. And again, sometimes people say that, watching subtitles is tiring. And I was always a little bit skeptical of that because people read text all day long on their phones. And certainly, like reading text on the screen shouldn't be particularly tiring. But I think if the spotting is not done well, then it does get tiring to watch subtitles because it's not presented in a comfortable way. And especially when the subtitles are too long so that you have to rush to read them in time. Subtitling films, it's apart from the translation, there's this whole question of the timing. Sometimes the actor pauses in a place that is a little bit awkward when you translate it into English. It sounds perfectly natural in Korean, but when you translate it into English, like they're pausing at an unusual, what can I say? Like it's very common in Korea to say like 내가, and then to pause for a long time and then continue the sentence. 내가 means I, and in English you don't say I and then stop for a long time and then continue. So when that happens on the screen, then it does affect the translation sometimes. And so this is an example from an independent film by director Kim Jong-kwan. And in the first line, spoken by Ayu, there's a long pause where we see the comma in this sentence. And so I'm going to show you three versions as well. So version 1, we just keep the subtitle on the screen as a single sentence.
근데 그쪽 제 애인 닮았어요.
아, 그래요?
네.
Okay, again, it's not terrible, but I think that there's this long pause, and she's only said something very short at the beginning. So it feels a little uncomfortable for the viewer. You're wondering, is that it? Is that all she's going to say? Is she going to say more? Version 2 is dividing the sentence into 2 subtitles.
근데 그쪽 제 애인 닮았어요.
아, 그래요?
네.
Okay, so there's this. Although this also feels a little bit awkward because in English you don't typically say, but you, and then stop. It feels like it's kind of been cut a little bit abruptly. And so the other option is to kind of change the translation a little bit to make it more natural when she makes a pause. So that'll be version 3.
근데 그쪽 제 애인 닮았어요.
아, 그래요?
네.
Okay, and so I think this feels a little bit more natural when you read it because it's common for people to say, but and then to pause for a bit. But it is an example where the translation has changed because of this pause that she makes. If she had spoken the line without the pause or with a shorter pause, then the translation might be different. And so this is one example, and I think there are many examples where you realize that subtitle translation is not about translating a text. It's also kind of translating the performance, because the way the actor delivers the line affects how you translate. There's also the question of word order. And word order is different in Korean and in English. And sometimes you look at a sentence and then you translate it in a way that feels natural. But then you realize that the word order has caused a problem. Particularly if there's an important piece of information, you always have to be aware of when the audience is going to get that information. And so I have another example here. This is another independent film called Mothers, 당신의 부탁. And I'll have to explain a little bit about the context here. The scene takes place towards the beginning of the film. The main character is someone who recently lost her husband. Her husband passed away. So she's still in mourning, and she's going through a really difficult stage in her life. And then her late husband's brother asks if he can meet with her. And basically, her late husband had been married years earlier when he was much younger. And he had a son with his previous wife. And then I think the wife passed away. The son had been living with his grandmother, but then the grandmother passes away too. So basically, there's a teenage boy who has no one to live with. He's too young to live on his own. And she's never met him, but in this scene, her late husband's brother is going to ask if she can take in the child and to raise the child. And she's not sure that she can handle it. And I think that, as they're talking, she's probably guessed what he's going to ask. But nonetheless, this is the moment where he asks her. In Korean, the yellow point is where the key request is communicated to the character. But actually, if you look at how it's translated right here, it's in the third subtitle in the English where the request comes. And in this case, it kind of changes how we watch the scene if the information comes a little bit later. And let me show you the scene first, and then I'll kind of explain what the issue is.
그래서 어쨌거나 그 애는 엄마가 키우는 게 맞지 않나 이렇게 얘기가 좀 나온 상황이에요. 그리고 또 아닌 말로 또 종욱이가 뭐 고아는 아니잖아요.
Okay, let me go back. Part of the joy of watching cinema lies in kind of seeing the characters respond to dramatic situations. I think that reaction shots are really important for actors. And this is a very subtle film, and so she doesn't make a big reaction. But in the second subtitle, we see her eyes kind of widen, and like her reaction takes place at this moment. The problem is, if you don't know Korean and you're reading the English subtitles, then you get to the third subtitle and you read this request. At that moment, we're looking at the man's face, and then we turn back to the woman's face at the end, and we think that this is the reaction shot if we're reading the English, but actually the reaction shot already came, and we missed it because the subtitles the order was changed. So in this case, I think it's better to use an order that feels a little bit unnatural, but which stays close to the original Korean. And so version 2, I think is the better version, because even if the English is a little bit more unnatural, I think it keeps the order the same.
그래서 어쨌거나 그 애는 엄마가 키우는 게 맞지 않나 이렇게 얘기가 좀 나온 상황이에요. 그리고 또 아닌 말로 또 종욱이가 뭐 고아는 아니잖아요.
Okay, so as we're translating, we have to kind of look at what's on the screen and try to figure out, when the characters or when the information is going to be communicated to the audience. And one other point is about direction. So sometimes a character is speaking to one person, and then they start speaking to a different person. And so in this case, the direction of their speech changes. This can happen as well if a character is kind of talking to themselves, like, what should I do? And then starts talking to the person in front of them. Ideally, when you have a change in direction, I think it's good to divide the subtitles. This is an example from the movie The Thieves. Lee Jung-jae's character has just stolen something from a rich kind of private museum, and the detectives know that he did it, but they don't have proof, and so they've come to kind of threaten him a little bit. But right at the end, the detective is saying, "Want a warrant? I'll bring one soon." And then he says, "Let's go to his partner." So the first part of this, he's speaking to Lee Jung-jae, and then he says, "Let's go to his partner." But in this movie, everybody speaks very fast. And so usually, in the first example, everything's together in one subtitle. But I think if you divide it into two subtitles, it's a little bit easier to follow. So this is version 1.
원래 법이라는 게 좀 느리지 않나?
이제부터 빨라지지 법이. 특별히 너한테는.
영장 문제 오래됐지. 내가 금방 보여줄게. 가자.
Okay, it happens kind of quickly, but it's easy to think that he's saying, let's go to Lee Jung-jae. But he doesn't mean that. He means his partner. So in version 2, it's being put into 2 separate subtitles.
원래 법이라는 게 좀 느리지 않나?
이제부터 빨라지지 법이. 특별히 너한테는.
영장 문제 오래됐지. 내가 금방 보여줄게. 가자.
Okay, and then lastly, I mean, sometimes I think there are good dramatic reasons to divide a sentence into 2. I don't have a video example from this, but there's a movie where one of the characters has kind of suffered a lot of discrimination throughout the film, and he's been in a difficult situation. And, you know, at a moment where another character has kind of betrayed him, he says, you know, I'm used to getting hurt. And then he says, and overcoming it. And I would argue in a scene like this, if you put the 2 things together, like the emotion in the first part, I'm used to getting hurt, is different from the emotion and overcoming it. And I think dramatically it has a bit more force. If you present this first, I'm used to getting hurt, and you let this information sink in, and then you have kind of the twist and overcoming it. Yeah, so there are dramatic reasons to kind of dividing subtitles too. Okay, so moving on from the timing, I think translating movies is really different from translating novels for a number of different reasons. And you know, part of it has to do with the timing, and like I showed you the examples of this, and how that affects the translation. But I think there are other ways in which it's different. When you translate a novel, basically you're creating a new text which replaces the old text. I mean, it's possible to read both at the same time, and you know, sometimes people who are bilingual might do that just to compare the 2 of them. But generally, we just, you know, we read the translation, and the translation creates its own energy. It becomes a work of art in itself, you know, based on the original work. I mean, films is somewhat different, because even if the audience doesn't understand Korean, as you're watching the film, you're hearing the actors' voices. And there's a lot of emotion in the actors' voices that we can understand, even if we don't know the language. And it's not only the voices. I mean, their facial expressions, the way they move their bodies, and all the other kind of visual elements. The audience is experiencing this at the same time as they're reading the translation below. And I think it's really important to kind of make sure that the translation matches what the audience is experiencing on the screen non-verbally. If the subtitles are more enthusiastic than the voice that we hear and the face that we see on screen, the audience very quickly notices that gap, and it will feel wrong, or vice versa. And yeah, one thing I realized is that when you're translating from films, like, you don't really need to create the energy in the same way in the translation, because the actors are doing that for you, and the audience is going to feel that energy coming off the screen. And so you need to, you know, provide the necessary information, and you want the subtitles to be emotional as well, but they don't have to do 100% of the work. And so actually the translation can be a little bit minimal, because what's happening on the screen helps to kind of fill in whatever is kind of being understated in the subtitles. Yeah, so this is very different. I mean, there are a lot of examples too where, I mean, ultimately, how you translate kind of comes down to the performance. And that's why I do think of it as translating a performance rather than translating a text. You know, often translating is about making choices about how to translate something. And, you know, even something as simple as the word like happy, 행복하다, you could translate it as happy, you could translate it as joyful if you wanted to. If someone says like, your daughter looks so happy, 딸이 너무 행복해 보여요. When I mean, you could simply write happy because it's the most common translation, but I think that in a film, you can also listen to the actor's voice and kind of think to yourself, you know, does this feel more like happy or more like joyful? In a film, sometimes you can even see the daughter's face and kind of come to your own decision about that. Yeah, so experiencing the actor's performance and then using that to influence how you make translation choices. I think that's a big part of subtitle translation as well. So I'll talk a bit about the process. And, you know, the process is different in Korea than in other countries. Like, you know, different countries have different systems in place. You know, OTT translation is also very, like they have their own system, which is quite different from the system that I usually work in. Generally in Korea, like film translation jobs, I mean, the companies don't post them publicly. Usually it's through people that you know. And so it is hard for new translators sometimes to get started. There's translators, they're usually hired by the international sales company or sales department. So like inside CJ Entertainment, for example, there's a department in charge of selling and marketing films abroad. And they also oversee the whole translation process. But they know a network of translators that they'll call up. And, you know, so they'll ask, they'll contact translators in that way. Sometimes the director will know a translator personally, or a producer. Whereas with OTT platforms, they don't hire translators directly. They typically work through a vendor, which is a company that represents large numbers of translators. And then Netflix will sign a contract with the vendor, and the vendor will have an agreement with the translator. And so it's kind of a, yeah, there's like a middle company involved. Usually films are subtitled, at least in English, before the film is completed. So often when I'm working on subtitles, like there's just a kind of a green screen in the background in some scenes because the CGI is not complete. Sometimes you see people dressed in green, like pulling things or something, and that's all erased in the final film. The sound mixing is also not complete, and sometimes actually that kind of affects the translation a little bit. But the reason this is done is because, you know, filmmakers are hoping to maybe submit their films to film festivals, or perhaps they go to markets where people sell and buy films. And it never really makes sense to wait until the film is 100% finished and then to start translating. Typically, they start earlier. Yeah, I usually have to sign an NDA before I can start working on a film. And then the process is actually quite simple. You know, they send me a copy of the film, either a streaming link, or sometimes they give me a file that I can download. in which case I have to be very careful not to lose my computer if it's stored on the computer's file or something. And then they send a dialogue list as well. But the dialogue list, it's not kind of spotted. It's a dialogue list that the post-production technicians are using. So it's simply a list of the dialogue. Subtitling programs are quite common, but actually in Korea, usually it's kind of ironic that for the big companies, I tend to use a less technologically advanced process. They simply have me write out the translation in MS Word or Google Docs or Excel. And then it's given over to a specialist in a post-production company who puts it onto the screen. When I'm working with independent filmmakers, then often they ask for a file with the timing. So in that case, I use a subtitling program. Yeah, as I mentioned before, you have to kind of spot the dialogue first, and then you can translate it. And I mean, typically you can just kind of divide up the sentence in Korean and then write the translation underneath. Yeah, and usually I ask for 2 weeks to do a feature film. I mean, sometimes the schedule is more rushed and you have to do it faster, but 2 weeks is usually enough time, I think, to do a good job. And so this is an example. Like on the left is the dialogue list that they send me. And so I'll listen to the scene and then decide how to divide it up. And then I write the translation underneath, and then I number all of the lines. So in line 45, there are 2 different characters, but there's very little pause between them, and they're speaking quickly. So it's easier to read if you put those lines together. Yeah, and so it looks like this. Yeah, I mean, after you do the first draft, typically there's a lot of back and forth as well. So there might be emails going back and forth where the production company or the director has requests for changes. There's some directors who want to sit down together with the translator and kind of go over everything in detail. And actually the big famous directors almost always want to spend a lot of time with the translator. When I worked on Parasite, there was kind of 2 days at the end of the process where we had meetings at CJ, and there was the director and the producer and 4 kind of staff members from CJ, and then a tech person and myself. And we watched through the whole film and kind of, discussed different lines. Sometimes people would throw out ideas. We didn't change a huge amount in that final session, but we were able to confirm that everybody kind of agreed on the translation. And I think that system is very good. Sometimes when you go to the theater or you watch films, like you'll come across translation errors, and it can be frustrating for the audience sometimes. I mean, Korea's famous for getting very angry at their translators if there's a mistake. But actually, if you have kind of a system where lots of people sit down and go over the subtitles together, and everybody's checking over everything, then yeah, you can typically avoid those kinds of mistakes. Okay, and I'll talk a bit about revising, because I think that one of the biggest mistakes that I made when I first started doing subtitle translation is I tried to make the first draft perfect, or as close to perfect as I could. And then, I'd read it over a couple more times before sending it to the company. But really, the second time and the third time you go through it is incredibly important. And I think that's when it becomes a good translation, not in the first draft. And so I've realized it makes sense, like, not to be too much of a perfectionist with the first draft. Just try to get it done, and then to spend a lot of time revising. These days I teach subtitle translation as well at the Literature Translation Institute of Korea. And so this is what I try to emphasize to my translation students. But yeah, while doing the revision, then, basically you watch through the film again, and the second time you go through, it's easier not just to think about kind of what to put as the translation, but to listen more closely to the actors' voices and to try to match the tone of what they're saying, to watch the actor's face. And then also to kind of make things more concise if you can. But I've noticed as well that, sometimes in the first draft, there's some really kind of difficult problem, and I'll spend a lot of time trying to think of a solution, and I'll waste a lot of time and then finally give up. And then later when I come back and do the second draft, sometimes that solution comes very quickly, just because it's almost like you're using a different part of your brain. But yeah, while revising, I try to cut things down and make them more concise. I listen to the actor's voice and try to make it kind of match the feeling of their performance. Sometimes there's a particular rhythm to the dialogue, and so I try to match that. In Parasite, for example, there were certain words that were repeated throughout the film, like 상징적이다, which is, symbolic or metaphorical. And I needed to make sure that I used the same word to translate that, because it's repeated in the film. And then you can try to kind of think about each character's style of speaking and try to give them a particular, voice or style of speaking. Because subtitles appear very briefly on the screen and then disappear, you have to keep them, you have to put as much information in as few words as possible, which is it's hard, particularly at first. I think it becomes a little bit easier with practice, but you have to keep it concise. I think it also makes sense in subtitles to make it somewhat easy to understand, quickly at a glance. I often use sentence fragments rather than full sentences in subtitles, because it feels like natural speech, and they're shorter and sometimes more direct. And so you don't want to kind of oversimplify the dialogue, but you want to make sure that the audience has time to read them. And so these are things that I typically do as I'm going through. You can rewrite this as she'll tell us next week, and it means almost the same thing, but it's much shorter. He'll feel better with rest. Particularly if somebody's responding to somebody's question, like, where are you headed next? Even if they use a full sentence in Korean when they're responding, if you can just write the library, then I think that works really well for subtitles. I also try to avoid phrases that have two meanings, because as you're watching the film, people might need to figure out what the meanings are. And I think in a novel, you can give the audience, or you can give readers time to kind of think about a sentence and to interpret a sentence. But the problem is with subtitles, they're flashing so quickly. So, I mean, words like, tell me about it or tell me about it, I mean, they have different meanings. You need to act could mean like you need to take action, or you need to act like an actor. And probably in the context it will be clear which meaning it is. But if you can just avoid these phrases entirely, then again, the audience will not feel as tired kind of trying to interpret them. And I don't do this all the time, but often kind of single word verbs work better than, two-word verbs. Argue and talk back, I mean, they don't mean exactly the same thing, but the top one, the meaning is more direct. It kind of hits you more forcefully, I think, than, arguing as opposed to talking back. So when possible, I tend to use single word verbs. The other thing that companies often remind me about is that, and I'm aware of it, when Korean movies screen around the world, at film festivals and in other places, the people reading the subtitles, their level of English will all be different. And some of them might be native speakers, some of them may speak English as a second language. It doesn't really make sense to use very difficult vocabulary or obscure slang unless you have a really good reason to use those kinds of words. I think it's better to be a little bit kinder to the audience. Subtitle translation is difficult if you're a perfectionist because you're constantly making compromises, usually because of length. Usually things are just too long, and what your ideal translation is, but it won't fit on the screen. So you have to change it. And so often, you have to choose a translation that's a little bit less natural or a little bit less accurate or emotional. But I think it's the right choice to make, even if it's a difficult choice, because they have to work as subtitles as well as just being a translation. Okay, let me mention a little bit about kind of what to do when you have things that the Korean audience is very familiar with, but the international audience might not be as familiar with. Sometimes you have the option of kind of changing it, but I think that it's a complicated question. So a line like, would you lend me 50,000 won? If people are familiar with Korean currency, they might not know that this is not a huge amount of money. You have the option of writing, could you lend me $50, or you could be more precise with the exchange rate and say like $30 or something. I don't know. You could change it, and it's common. I packed some soju for a picnic. When I first started 20 years ago, whenever I wrote soju in my subtitles, the company would come back to me and say, I don't think people outside of Korea know what soju is. And now I think they know because Korean culture is more familiar to people around the world. But still, there may be some percentage of the audience that doesn't know what soju is. They've never heard this word. So you need to sort of think about them as well. And then your boyfriend looks like Lee Byung-hun. Maybe you know who this is, maybe you don't. I've seen examples of subtitles where people would translate this as your boyfriend looks like Brad Pitt, which I think is terrible. But yeah, that's an option for the translator. And so, I mean, every time I come across something like this, I mean, these are the questions that I tend to ask. You know, is it really important that the viewer understand precisely what this means? You know, in terms of currency, if a character goes into a convenience store and buys a bag of chips for 2,000 won, it doesn't really matter that the audience understand exactly how much 2,000 won is. Whereas if somebody says, would you lend me 50,000 won? Somehow I think we need to tell the audience that this is not like lending $50,000. It's, you know, a smaller amount of money. B, will the meaning be clear in context? Like with the soju, even if you don't know what soju is, if the next scene, everybody's at a picnic and they're drinking out of green bottles and getting drunk, like that's kind of all you need to know. So yeah, again, in the past, you know, companies would say like, can you say whiskey? Or like, you know, and it feels completely wrong. You could just say alcohol, but that's really boring as well. So yeah, if you can keep it as soju, that's probably best. And then in the Lee Byung-hun case, like, you know, if you've never heard this name before, you might not know, is this a compliment? You know, is it an insult? You know, Lee Byung-hun could be some ugly politician. And so it's helpful if you can add some words, like your boyfriend is as good looking as Lee Byung-hun. And this gives them the general idea. You know, if possible, I don't feel comfortable like replacing Korean things with kind of internationally more recognized things. But I do think that you have to kind of consider it according to the situation. And the director often has an opinion about this as well. So in Parasite, there were a lot of cases like this. And actually, Bong Joon-ho is a director who kind of prefers to change things. So for example, Kakao Talk. I'm guessing people in this room might be more familiar with Kakao Talk than most people outside of Korea. But at the beginning of the film, there's, you know, in the dialogue, somebody references Kakao Talk. And, you know, personally, I think in that situation, we can figure out that it's a messaging app. But Bong Joon-ho is very clear. He's like, no, let's change it. He said to me, Messenger or WhatsApp, you pick. And I said, okay, WhatsApp. I'm sure that the executives at Kakao Talk were probably quite upset that we changed it in the film. There's a kind of a famous line from the film where literally Song Kang-ho's character says, does Seoul National University have a major in document forgery? And it's a joke. Because it's humor, you have to kind of understand it immediately. And it's important that people recognize that the university is like a top university. And Director Bong was concerned that, you know, if we wrote it as Seoul National University, that some of the humor might be lost. And so here too, he said, you know, Harvard or Oxford. So I said, okay, Oxford. And then the top example, there's a scene where Lee Jung-eun's character starts to imitate a North Korean news anchor. And when you live in South Korea, sometimes on the news you see broadcasts from the north. And there's one woman in particular who kind of delivers the news on North Korean television, and she has a very distinctive manner of speaking. And so in this scene, when she starts to imitate it, the South Korean audience knows what she's doing just by listening to her intonation. You know, the international audience, she's talking about North Korea and nuclear missiles and other things. But there's nothing in the dialogue to let the audience know that, you know, she's actually imitating a North Korean news anchor. So in this case, in one of the responses by her husband, We just translated it a completely different way and said nobody can imitate North Korean news anchors like you. Yeah, I mean, the original dialogue is like, you know, you're the best at North Korean gags. I love you, honey. And I'll show you the clip, but yeah, I think here it was necessary to actually change the translation and explain things for the audience.
여보, 이 전송 버튼이 완전히 무슨 미사일 버튼이네.
뭔 얘기야, 여보?
아니, 이 버튼만 누른다 그러면 저 양반들 꼼짝을 못 하잖아. 이게 완전 북한 미사일이야. 북핵 미사일 버튼.
경의하는 최고領導자 김정은 동지께서는 오늘 이번 일가족 사기단의 동영상을 보시면서 그들의 악랄하고 저급한 도발에 대해서 경악과 분노를 금치 못하시었다.
이거 진짜 오랜만이다, 여보.
이에 위대한 수령께서는 작금의 한반도 비핵화의 과정 속에서 마지막 남은 단 한 발의 핵탄두를 저들 미치광 일가족의 간악한 아가리에 처박을 하는 궁극의 지령을 내리셨다.
역시 종북 개그의 지존 사랑해요.
저들의 구린내 나는 오장육부를 최후의 핵 배기장으로 삼아 마침내 비핵화와 세계 평화를 이룩하시려는 위대한領導자 김정은 동지. 똑바로 안 들어 이것들아.
Okay, I have a couple more examples where I think that the Korean audience would see things a little bit differently from the international audience. This is a movie from 2015 based on a real life person. And the main character, in the middle of the film, he is injured and the doctor tells him that he needs to stop climbing. And, you know, he's a world famous alpinist. He's climbed Everest and all these other Himalayan mountains. And so he's really upset. And his wife walks into the kitchen one night and he's drinking all by himself. He's drinking soju with no anju, no side dishes. And she thinks he looks really pathetic. And so this is the scene.
안주도 없이. 더 이상 무리하면 척추에 문제가 생겨서 평생 휠체어 타야 될 수도 있다잖아요.
Okay, I think 안주도 없이 is a really nightmare to translate. Partly because, you know, in many cultures, I think it's perfectly natural to just sit down and drink without eating anything. I don't know, I grew up in a culture where that's totally normal. And yet, you know, in the Korean context, you know, Korean viewers are going to look at him and, you know, it makes him look kind of pathetic and almost like an alcoholic to be sitting and drinking, and, you know, it's bad for his stomach. It looks as if he's kind of given up on life, you know, just drinking without eating anything. And so, you know, we see his wife kind of respond to him, like we see her facial expression. And then she does go to the refrigerator and take out some food. But I had a really hard time translating this, and I don't think there's a 100% effective way to do it. This is one of those moments where I wish I could put an asterisk and an explanation below that, you know, Koreans never drink without side dishes. I mean, ultimately, we translated this as at least eat something, so that kind of expresses her frustration a little bit and telling him that, you know, eat something as you drink. There's that. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the phrase, like, 호랑이 담배 피던 시절. I remember the first time this is sort of like the once upon a time type of phrase. And I remember the first time I saw it, and I loved this phrase. I thought it was so interesting, but I kept trying to imagine how that worked and like how tigers would smoke. And so this expression comes up in this scene, in this film. And, the character, he says, I'm going to tell you an old story. And then, 옛날 얘기야. 그래서 호랑이 담배 피던 시절 얘기 아니고요. I think there are a couple different ways you could translate this. You could do it more literally and say, it's not an old folk tale from the time when tigers smoked pipes. Or you could say it's not an old fairy tale set once upon a time, which kind of works the same way in English as it does in Korean. I have a clip for this, but there are no subtitles on the clip. I'll just show you for a second.
스테파노. 옛날 얘기 하나 해줄게요. 옛날 얘기라 그래서 호랑이 담배 피던 시절 얘기는 아니고요. 나라에서 천주교를 금지하던 그 시절 얘기예요. 1845년 어느 가을날 금강 황산포구에 중국에서 온 배 한 척이 은밀히 도착했어요.
So basically, after he says this, we launch into a very long flashback. It's like a 10-minute flashback that's set in the past, not in the, as he said, it's not in the very distant past, but it is quite a long time ago. And it's only at the end of this flashback that we realize that the people he's been talking about in this flashback are relatives, kind of like the great-grandfather or great-uncle or something of these young boys, so that they have a personal connection to this story. So what he's saying now is, I'm going to tell you an old story, but it's not so old that it doesn't have some connection to the present. But I really kind of, these are not the only two options, but I think that it's an interesting question about whether you try to keep this phrase, which is a really interesting phrase in Korean, and that if you put it in, maybe somebody learns a little bit about Korean culture. Or if you translate it as be, which is probably a little bit more clear in terms of the meaning. And the other thing I worried about is when you say tigers smoked pipes, I'm worried that for the next 10 seconds, people are just going to be thinking about tigers. And because, tigers aren't the point here. And for me personally, if I were translating a short story and this phrase came up, I'd be more inclined to go with A, because the reader has time to kind of stop and think about the phrase. In this scene, I was worried about using A because some crucial information comes right after it, and I was worried that they'd be distracted and would miss the important information that would come right next. So there's no kind of right or wrong answer to this, but I think that these are the kind of dilemmas that you come up with sometimes in Korean. And briefly, I'll just talk about dialect. This is, I think, the worst thing that I have to deal with, because a lot of Korean films have a very distinct regional dialect, and the audience, as they're watching the film, are very aware of this dialect, and it's part of the pleasure of watching the film. But I think it's, for one thing, I think it's really hard to, particularly in English, to express a dialect in written words. Like you can change the spelling, but it's often quite awkward. It's actually more common in Korean to like write out different dialects, in writing. And then there's the question of, when we hear the characters speaking in a dialect, it's not just the words that they're using, but their intonation and the way that they're speaking. It's very three-dimensional. But when you put it into the subtitles, it becomes two-dimensional. And my basic point is when you try too hard to do this in the subtitles, that it becomes very awkward and distracting for the audience, I think. I mean, maybe other translators are able to handle this better than I can, but I often don't try to express too much of the dialect. Unless there's a situation, like if you have two dialects and it's kind of clashing in a particular scene, or like there are movies where you have a character who grew up in Chola province, speaking a particular dialect, and then she moves to Seoul and kind of works hard to lose her regional accent and to speak with the Seoul accent. But in moments of great stress, the Chola accent comes out again. I think for that, you have to try to express that somehow, because it's a really important part of the scene. But it is really hard. I mean, sometimes you can think about how to translate names as well. We had a conversation with Bong Joon-ho about this. Actually, before I even started the translation of Parasite, he sent me an email that was like 4 pages long with all these ideas about, how to approach different lines or difficult parts of the translation. And one thing he said to me is about this character, Min-hyuk. He appears early in the film, but only in the first part of the film, and then he kind of disappears. But later in the film, they talk about him. So the audience needs to remember the name Min-hyuk if they are going to make this connection. And Bong Joon-ho is always thinking, I think, from the point of view of the audience, including the international audience. And he knows that it's more difficult for international viewers to remember Korean names. And so he said to me, is there something we can do to his name to make it a little bit easier to remember? And so we ultimately decided to write his name as Min rather than Min-hyuk. It's the only character in the film who has a single syllable name, and it makes it a little bit easier to understand or to remember. There's another example of this from Bong Joon-ho's movie Mother from 2009. There's a character called Jongpal, and Jongpal is a very easy name for the Korean audience to remember. But he's an important character, and people are constantly talking about him. And in this case, the director himself decided that his name should be written as Crazy JP in English. And so every time people are talking about him, they say, "Oh, I saw Crazy JP." And that's impossible to forget. And so, it's kind of an example of how Bong Joon-ho kind of thinks about these things. Okay, and I have a couple more examples where, in some ways you get a little bit of meaning added to the translation. Not in a big way. I mean, it's kind of a subtle kind of thing. But this is one example from the movie The Day After by Hong Sang-soo. And, this character is in a taxi and it suddenly starts to snow. And she's talking with a taxi driver about the snow. And then she says, 너무 고맙죠, about the snow. Literally, it's like I'm so thankful for this snow. But it's a little bit awkward to write in English. And I'll show you the scene.
이거 갑자기 눈이 꽤 오네요.
네, 눈이 많이 오네요. 예쁘다.
정말 아름답죠. 눈이라는 거, 밤눈이 참 예쁘죠.
네, 너무 고맙죠.
Okay, so this line, it's very simple in Korean, but the way she says it has a lot of emotion in it. And it's the last line of dialogue, so it kind of sticks in the viewer's mind. And so it seemed like, the translation, if you just say, I'm very thankful for it, it doesn't really kind of express the emotion of it. And so I thought about saying, it's such a blessing. My only concern is that the word blessing, in English, it has a little bit of a religious connotation to it, the feeling of it. And, the word is used in many different contexts, but it has that little extra connotation. And so I wanted to make sure that the director was okay with this. Actually, it kind of fits the character because she talks about religion early in the film and about the fact that she's Christian. So it kind of suited her character. I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't kind of overemphasizing that part of her character. And one of the good things about working in Korea is that I have access to the directors, and I can usually ask them questions. And in this case, he just said yes, he liked it. So that was very simple. When you don't have access to the directors, then you have to kind of take that responsibility for yourself because, the translation, it does kind of affect how we see characters. And, this is a subtle kind of thing. But yeah. This is a scene from The Handmaiden, 2016. And let me show you the clip first.
이 큰 집의 안주인이 어쩌다가 집이 너무 커서 미쳤나?
헤비!
それ以上入っちゃダメ。
肝に銘じておけ。蛇は無知の境界線だ。
Okay, so there's a lot going on in this clip. First of all, it's Korean and Japanese mixed together. And in this film, I'm not aware of any other movie that did this earlier, although maybe Park Chan-wook saw something earlier and copied the idea. But the Japanese text is translated in yellow, and the Korean text is translated in white. So if you're not familiar with both languages, you still know what language they're speaking. And that's important in this film because you have Koreans pretending to be Japanese and then suddenly switching back into Korean. The movie's based on an English novel, Fingersmith. And the original novel set in Victorian England. He decided to set this story in colonial Korea. And this is the first time I worked with Park Chan-wook. And just after I got the job, the first thing he said to me was, please read the novel that the movie's based on. And luckily, I'd already read the novel, and so I didn't have to hurry through it. But they told me specifically to get an ebook, which is searchable, because they said that there are lines of dialogue in the novel that he tried to kind of replicate in the Korean script. And it didn't have to be exactly the same, but he wanted me to make the translation as close as possible to the original novel's dialogue. And so this scene is very similar in both films, in both the film and the novel. In the novel, it's not a snake, it's a finger pointing in the air. But there's a library where nobody is supposed to come in. And in the novel, they say that hand marks the bounds of innocence here. So outside the room, you are innocent, but once you step into the room, like you lose your innocence. And so when translating, I recognized that the scene was the same, and I checked things, and then I wrote that snake marks the bounds of innocence here. Later, when I actually got to sit down with the director, and the producer as well is kind of bilingual. He grew up in New Zealand. We were talking about the film together. But Park Chan-wook said, is innocence the right word? Shouldn't it be ignorance instead of innocence? And after talking, we realized that he had read Fingersmith in Korean translation. And in the translated novel, they used the words 무지의 경계선, which is much closer to the bounds of ignorance. And Park Chan-wook kind of had that concept in his mind when he was writing the script. And he liked this idea of a line between like people who know and people who don't know. And then so we had this kind of question about whether to kind of use the word innocence like the novel, or to use the word ignorance like what he had in mind as he wrote the script. And ultimately, we did bounds of knowledge, which is almost the same as bounds of ignorance, because again, you have a line and there are people who know and people who don't know. But the phrase bounds of knowledge, it sounds a little bit like tree of knowledge from the Garden of Eden, the novel, or the Bible. And there's a snake as well, which makes people think about, the Garden of Eden. And so I asked him, does the snake represent the snake in the Bible? Because I assumed that was the case, and he said no, that the snake meant something else. But here we had to decide whether to use the word knowledge, knowing that some people might interpret this as a reference to the Bible, or whether to use the word ignorance. But he thought about it, and he liked the idea of using the word knowledge and having that reference be a possible interpretation. Okay, I'm running out of time. I think, let me show you one. Okay, I'll show you one last example from the movie Decision to Leave. Okay, this too is another movie that has different languages, and one of the main characters is the Chinese actress, Tang Wei. And in this scene, she's speaking Chinese, but the Korean character records what she's saying on his phone, and later he runs it through a translator, and so that the voice comes out in Korean, translating what she said.
是我无恙，这个我给你吃的呀，算了吧。你要是非要想送我什么礼物不可，你们刑警去把他信拿来给我，我有点想要。
또 까마귀야. 내가 너한테 밥 준다고? 그럼 됐어. 나에게 선물이 꼭 하고 싶다면 그 친절한 형사의 심장을 가져다 주세요. 난 좀 갖고 싶네.
Okay, so there's a line here, like bring me, actually in Korean it says like bring me the heart of that kind detective. But in Korean, it uses the word 심장, which is like the organ. When he hears this, like it doesn't sound romantic like it does in English, like bring me the heart of that kind detective. It sounds like, you know, like ripping the heart out, and, you know, this bloody beating heart. And, you know, it was supposed to sound a little bit shocking in this situation. There's a scene later where he asks, like, why did you ask the cat to bring you the heart, like my heart? And then she explains that it was a mistranslation.
눈 감아요.
정말로 내 심장이 갖고 싶어요?
심장.
그걸로 뭐 하게요?
아, 마음이라고 했습니다. 심장이 아니라. 자.
Okay, so I don't know if this was the best way to handle this, but we had a long discussion with the director about this. And we thought that one of the ways to make this kind of a shocking moment in the first scene is, instead of saying heart, to say head, like bring me the head of that kind detective. It's a kind of violent image. And then later in this scene, she can explain, oh, you know, I didn't say head, I said heart. And that sounds much more kind of romantic. Thing is, in Korean, like it's a very different translation from the original. We thought about saying like dripping heart or something like that, but ultimately the director liked this one best. There was just one little thing, because there's one of Park Chan-wook's favorite directors is Sam Peckinpah, and one of his most famous movies is Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. And so I said, if we put the subtitle, Bring Me the Head of That Kind Detective, lots of film critics are going to think this is a Sam Peckinpah reference, even though the Korean is very different. And he decided that he liked it. And so this is something that, it's like something that's added in translation because it's not in the original. But again, I was able to make sure that the director was okay with this. Okay, so the lecture I've taken up a lot of time, and I think there's just a little bit, we've what, 5 minutes? Does anybody have any questions that you'd like to ask?
So really thank you for your work, and we all appreciate it. I wanted to ask you, music-wise, how the translation is made into movies, because I think in Asian films, the songs are really related to the overall meaning of the film. But sometimes, I mean, in Italy, we don't usually translate the song. So why does that happen? And is it common in Korean films to translate the songs?
I think sometimes they're translated and sometimes they're not. It does depend on the situation. And there's a movie called Smugglers from 2 years ago. Milsu is the Korean title. by director Yu Seung-wan. And it's set in the 1970s, and they had a lot of 1970s songs. And so initially he asked for all of the songs to be translated. But then we tried to put them on the screen. And the problem was there's dialogue at the same time as the songs. And so there was too much text appearing on the screen, and it was too kind of difficult to follow. So even though the lyrics were really interesting, we ultimately had to pull many of them out. In The Handmaiden, there's a song that plays in the end credits, and so he did ask me to translate that song. And translating songs is quite fun because you have a kind of rhythm to it, and you can try to match the rhythm. I think that most directors want to translate everything, but then sometimes you have to see about if you're giving the audience too much text to read, and so sometimes they decide to not translate it. I think that's usually why.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time for eventual question. Avete eventualmente qualche domanda? Okay, we can end up. Thank you so much. I hope see you again here in Siena.